The Inheritance Wars. How I outplayed my manipulative in-laws. This is my story of how I lost everything, almost lost my children, but ultimately created a life better than I could have imagined, all while watching my in-laws destroy themselves with their own greed. Part 1. The Golden Years. I met James Harrington during my final year of law school. He was completing his MBA at the same university, and we literally bumped into each other at a campus cafe. I had been up all night preparing for my mock trial, juggling 3 different textbooks while attempting to order the strongest coffee available. He was there for a morning study session before his finance presentation. When my stack of books tumbled to the floor, he didn't just help me pick them up. He offered to quiz me on contract law while we waited for our orders. There was something genuine about him that I hadn't found in the other Type A personalities that populated our prestigious East Coast university. By the time our coffees arrived, we had exchanged numbers. What followed was a whirlwind romance. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and I said yes, without hesitation. I was 26, he was 28, and we were convinced we had our whole lives mapped out. I should mention that I knew James came from money. The Harringtons were old money wealthy, the kind of family with multiple homes, private jets, and a family foundation. His father, Richard Harrington, had expanded the family's real estate holdings exponentially in the 1980s and 90s. His mother, Victoria, was from another wealthy family and served on the boards of numerous art museums and charitable organizations. When I first met them at their estate in Connecticut, I was intimidated but determined to make a good impression. They were cold but polite. Victoria scrutinized everything from my clothes to my table manners, while Richard interrogated me about my career plans. I was from a middle-class background in Ohio, my father a high school teacher, and my mother a nurse. I had put myself through undergrad and law school, working part-time jobs, and taking out loans. Ambitious, I see, Victoria had commented when I explained my plans to specialize in family law. Though I would have thought corporate law would be more suitable for someone joining our family. I didn't miss her meaning, but James squeezed my hand under the table. Later, he assured me they would warm up to me. They're just protective, he explained. Once they see how happy you make me, they'll come around. I wanted to believe him. And in some ways, it seemed like they did come around, or at least reached a state of cold acceptance. We were invited to family events. They attended our wedding, though Victoria complained about my modest choices for the ceremony. When we bought our first home, a comfortable but not extravagant house in a good school district outside Boston, they gifted us some family heirlooms for decoration. James had chosen to forge his own path rather than join the family business directly. He started a successful investment firm with a focus on sustainability and ethical investments. I joined a family law practice and quickly made a name for myself handling complex custody cases. We were building our own wealth on our own terms. When I became pregnant with our first child, Emma, the Harringtons seemed genuinely excited. Victoria organized an elaborate baby shower, and Richard set up a trust fund for the baby. Our son, Ethan, followed 2 years later. For a while, it felt like we had achieved the impossible: independence from the Harrington fortune while maintaining family relationships. We weren't living at their level of opulence, but we were comfortable. Our combined income put us solidly in the upper middle class. We took nice vacations, saved for retirement, and put money aside for the kids' college funds. James and I both worked demanding jobs, but we made time for family dinners and weekend activities with the children. For 8 years, life was good. Not perfect, but good. Victoria would occasionally make passive-aggressive comments about my parenting choices or my career, but I learned to let them roll off my back. Richard would hint that James could do so much more if he joined the family business, but he never forced the issue. In retrospect, I wonder if they were just biding their time. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday in April. James was driving home from a late meeting when his car was struck by a drunk driver who had crossed the median. He died on impact. The police officer who showed up at our door at 11:43 p.m. delivered the news that shattered our world. I collapsed in the entryway, unable to breathe, unable to process that my husband, who had texted me just 2 hours earlier to say he was wrapping up and heading home, was gone forever. Emma was 6 and Ethan was 4. How was I supposed to tell them that their daddy wasn't coming home? How was I supposed to function when half of me had been ripped away? The next few days passed in a blur. James's parents arrived the following morning. I remember Victoria pulling me into a stiff embrace, her expensive perfume suffocating me. Richard stood in our living room, looking out of place among the toys scattered across the floor. They took over the funeral arrangements, which I was grateful for at the time. I could barely get out of bed, let alone plan a service. Friends and colleagues brought food, took the kids for playdates, and helped with the immediate logistics. My parents flew in from Ohio and stayed in our guest room. My mother took care of Emma and Ethan while my father handled the influx of visitors and phone calls. The funeral was elaborate, more about the Harrington legacy than the man I had loved. Richard gave a speech about James's potential and the future he would never fulfill. Victoria curated a photo display that featured more childhood photos and Harrington family events than images of our life together. But I was too numb to object. It was after the funeral that the first warning signs appeared. "We need to discuss the children's future," Richard said as we sat in my living room the day after we buried James. "Their education, their trusts, their place in the family." I looked at him through swollen eyes. "They're staying with me. We'll be fine here." Victoria exchanged a look with Richard that made my skin crawl. "Of course, dear. But there are advantages we can provide that that would be more challenging on your own." "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but we need time to grieve before making any big decisions." They backed off, temporarily. They returned to Connecticut a few days later, but not before Victoria had taken inventory of our home, commenting on items that were family heirlooms and suggesting they might be more appropriate in the main house for safekeeping. I was too exhausted to argue. I let her take a silver tea service and some artwork that had belonged to James's grandmother. In hindsight, this was my first mistake, showing weakness. The Harringtons, I would learn, were like sharks. They could smell blood in the water. I threw myself into establishing a new normal for my children. I took a month off work, using a combination of bereavement leave and vacation time. I found a grief counselor for myself and child psychologists for Emma and Ethan. We established new routines, created memory boxes for James, and I made sure they knew it was okay to cry, to be angry, to miss their daddy. The life insurance payout and James's retirement accounts gave us financial breathing room. I wasn't worried about money in the immediate future, though I knew I would eventually need to make some adjustments to our lifestyle as a single-income household. What I didn't know was that the Harringtons were already plotting. While I was focused on helping my children heal, they were preparing for war. Part 2. The first attack. The first real salvo came 3 months after James's death. I had returned to work part-time, finding some solace in helping other families navigate their own legal challenges. The kids were in summer day camp, showing small signs of adjustment to our new reality. I received a formal letter from Whitaker and Stone, the Harringtons' longtime legal firm. It requested a meeting to discuss matters pertaining to the guardianship and financial security of Emma and Ethan Harrington. My stomach dropped. I immediately called my colleague Marcus, who specialized in probate and estate law. "They can't take your kids," he assured me after reviewing the letter. "You're their mother. You haven't done anything wrong. But be careful. Families like the Harringtons play by different rules." I agreed to the meeting but insisted it take place at my law firm rather than at their lawyer's office. Marcus would represent me. I wasn't walking into whatever trap they were setting without backup. Bradford Whitaker III himself showed up, alongside a junior associate who carried a leather portfolio bulging with documents. Richard and Victoria attended in person as well, dressed as if for a board meeting rather than a family discussion. "We're concerned about the children's future," Richard began without preamble. "Their education, their social connections, their inheritance, these require careful management." I kept my face neutral. "I'm managing their futures just fine." Victoria smiled thinly. "Sarah, dear, we know you're doing your best. But the Harrington name comes with certain expectations. The children should be attending Grayson Academy, not public school. They should be spending summers at the lake house, winters at the ski lodge. They need to be introduced to the right social circles. Those aren't James's values, I said firmly. He wanted them to have normal childhoods. We discussed all of this. Bradford Whitaker cleared his throat. Mrs. Harrington, we've been instructed to inform you that the trusts established for Emma and Ethan have certain conditions. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, as trustees, have significant discretion over how and when funds are distributed. Marcus leaned forward. What conditions? Those trusts were established as irrevocable gifts at birth. The primary trusts, yes, said the junior associate, extracting a document. However, the secondary trusts established in Mr. James Harrington's name after his children were born contain clauses regarding the children's education, religious upbringing, and social development. The trustees can withhold distributions if they feel these conditions aren't being met. I felt a chill. James had mentioned additional trusts his parents had set up, but he never indicated there were strings attached. Had he even known? I'd like to see those trust documents, Marcus said. Of course, Bradford replied smoothly. We'll provide copies. In the meantime, we have a proposal. Richard took over. We'd like the children to spend every other weekend with us in Connecticut. They should attend Grayson Academy starting this fall. We've already secured places for them. During summer and major holidays, they'll join us at the appropriate family residences. In exchange, we'll supplement your household income to maintain their current standard of living. The implication was clear: comply or face financial consequences. I looked directly at Victoria. And if I decline? Her eyes hardened. Then we'll be forced to reevaluate the children's financial future. Additionally, as James's parents, we could petition for grandparents' rights or even guardianship if we feel the children's best interests aren't being served. On what grounds? Marcus scoffed. Emotional distress following their father's death, Bradford suggested. Potential instability in their home environment as their mother struggles to balance work and childcare. Concerns about their educational and social development. They were threatening to paint me as an incompetent mother. The rage I felt was tempered only by the strategic part of my brain that was already calculating my next moves. I'll need time to review the trust documents and consider your proposal, I said evenly. Of course, Richard nodded. Take a week. After they left, Marcus turned to me. They're bluffing about guardianship. No court would remove children from a fit parent just because the grandparents are wealthier. But they could make my life hell trying, I said. And they could restrict the trust funds. Let me review everything first, he advised. Don't agree to anything yet. Over the next few days, we pored over the trust documents. The secondary trusts did indeed contain clauses about education and appropriate upbringing consistent with family traditions. The language was vague enough to give the trustees, Richard and Victoria, significant latitude. They're using the trusts as leverage, Marcus concluded. They probably can't get custody, but they can make you financially dependent on their goodwill. I thought about my options. I could fight them in court, but that would be expensive and traumatic for the children. I could comply with their demands, but that would mean surrendering control of my kids' lives. Or I could find another way. I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with, I told Marcus. Not just legally, but personally. Why are they doing this now? James always said they were controlling, but this feels extreme even for them. Rich families have their own logic, Marcus shrugged. Maybe it's about maintaining the dynasty. But I needed more. I contacted Lisa, James's cousin, who had always been friendly to me despite keeping her distance from the main family. We met for coffee, at a place far from my office or home. I'm not surprised, she said after I explained the situation. Uncle Richard has always been obsessed with legacy. But there's more going on. The family business has been struggling since the pandemic. They've had to liquidate some assets. Richard's been making riskier investments trying to recoup losses. So this is about money? I asked, confused. But James wasn't directly involved in the family business. Lisa stirred her latte thoughtfully. It's about control. And James's investment firm is doing well. Very well from what I hear. It's outperforming the family portfolio. That must be killing Richard. A piece clicked into place. James is firm. I own his shares now. Lisa nodded.
Exactly.
James built something successful outside Richard's control, and now that asset belongs to you, not the Harrington family. The kids are leverage. I felt a cold clarity descend. They want to control the children to control me, and ultimately to control James's legacy and assets. Most likely, Lisa agreed. Be careful, Sarah. Richard doesn't lose gracefully. I thanked her and left with a new understanding of the battlefield. This wasn't just about the children or even the trusts. It was about power, control, and a wounded patriarchal ego. I called a meeting with James's business partner, Michael, the next day. He confirmed that the firm was indeed thriving. James had left his 60% ownership to me, with detailed instructions for how his shares should be voted if I chose not to take an active role in the company. He wanted to ensure you and the kids were taken care of, Michael explained. The firm is set to distribute significant dividends this quarter. Between that and the insurance payout, you should be financially secure. I nodded, formulating a plan. I want to learn more about the business, I told him. Not to interfere, but to understand what James built. Can we schedule regular briefings? Michael seemed relieved. Of course. James always said you were the smartest person he knew. He'd be happy to have your input. Armed with this knowledge, I decided on my approach to the Harringtons. I wouldn't fight them directly, not yet. I would strategically give ground where it didn't matter to gather intelligence and build my position. I called Richard and agreed to allow the children to visit them every other weekend, with the stipulation that they would be returned by Sunday afternoon and that I would occasionally join these visits. I refused the Grayson Academy demand but suggested I would consider it for middle school. I accepted their offer to use the vacation homes, but insisted I would be present for all extended stays. This seems reasonable, Richard said, though I could hear the disappointment in his voice that I hadn't capitulated entirely. We'll expect the children this Friday. I'll bring them myself, I said firmly. That first weekend visit was tense. The Harrington estate was as imposing as ever, a sprawling colonial mansion set on 30 manicured acres. The children were initially excited about the grandeur, the indoor pool, the horses, the game room full of expensive toys. But by Sunday, Emma was anxious to return home, and Ethan had a meltdown when Victoria corrected his table manners for the dozenth time. I observed everything. How Richard took business calls even during family meals. How Victoria scrutinized and criticized every aspect of the children's behavior. How they spoke about the Harrington way as if it were gospel. Most importantly, I noticed the subtle digs at me and attempts to undermine my authority with the children. Mommy lets us have ice cream after dinner sometimes, Ethan had said hopefully. Victoria's response was telling. Well, at Grandma's house, we follow proper nutrition. When you're here more often, you'll learn our better habits. On the drive home, I asked the kids gentle questions about their experience. Emma, perceptive beyond her years, provided the most insight. Grandma said I should tell you I want to go to the fancy school, she admitted. She said you're keeping me from having nice things because you're jealous. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, but I kept my voice casual. What do you think about that? Emma was quiet for a moment. I think Grandma doesn't know that you let me take ballet and soccer. She said I have to choose one because ladies don't play sports. I smiled. And what did you tell her? That you said I can be a lady and play sports. And then she got that pinchy face like when Ethan spilled grape juice on her white couch. I laughed despite myself. My daughter was not only seeing through Victoria's manipulation but standing her ground. James would have been proud. The weekend visits continued. Each time, I gathered more information. I learned about Richard's investment failures from overheard phone calls. I noticed Victoria's drinking increased as the evening progressed. I saw how they presented a united front in public, but barely spoke to each other in private. I also made sure to be unfailingly polite, to dress impeccably for drop-offs and pickups, and to express gratitude for their time with the children. I was building a public record of being cooperative and reasonable. Meanwhile, I was preparing for the real battle. Part 3. The Paper Trail. The biweekly visits to the Harrington estate continued through the summer and into the fall. Each time, I documented everything, what the children reported, any concerning interactions, any attempts to alienate me. I kept a detailed digital journal, backed up in multiple locations. I also began quietly building a network. I reconnected with friends from law school who had gone into family law in Connecticut, where the Harringtons held court. I joined several boards and committees in my community, establishing myself as an engaged single parent despite my challenging circumstances. I maintained close relationships with Emma and Ethan's teachers and counselors, ensuring they saw me as an involved, capable mother. At James's firm, I attended quarterly meetings and slowly educated myself about the business. Michael was an excellent teacher, patient with my questions and generous with his time. The more I learned, the more I appreciated what James had built, a truly ethical investment firm that generated excellent returns without the cutthroat tactics Richard employed. By November, 6 months after James's death, I had established my new normal. The children were in therapy but doing well in school. I had returned to full-time work, with a flexible schedule that allowed me to be home when they returned from school most days. We had a reliable routine that included memory rituals for James, Sunday pancakes the way he made them, a photo by their beds that they could talk to at night, special ornaments for the approaching holidays. That's when the Harringtons escalated. It began with a call from Emma's teacher, asking about her planned absence for the following week. What absence? I asked, confused. Mrs. Harrington, the grandmother, called to say Emma would be missing school for a family trip to Paris. She requested homework assignments. My blood ran cold. I never authorized this. Emma is not missing school. Next came an email from Bradford Whitaker, formally requesting that the children spend Thanksgiving at the Harrington estate rather than with my modest family gathering in Ohio. I forwarded these communications to Marcus with the message: "It's starting." I called Richard directly. "The children will not be missing school for Paris, and we already have Thanksgiving plans with my parents." Victoria thought the children would benefit from cultural exposure, he said smoothly. "And our Thanksgiving celebration would be more befitting their station. Your parents are welcome to join us, of course." "That's not the point," I said, keeping my voice level. "You don't make plans for my children without consulting me. I'm their parent. We are trying to provide opportunities you cannot," he replied, a hint of steel entering his voice. "Perhaps it's time to revisit our arrangement. The limited weekends aren't sufficient for proper cultural and social development." "Our arrangement is working fine," I said firmly. "But to be clear, any travel requires my explicit permission, and educational decisions are mine alone." He was silent for a moment. "We'll discuss this further after Thanksgiving. Speaking of which, Victoria has already ordered custom outfits for the children. It would be a shame to waste them." The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost laughable. "My decision stands. We'll see you for the regular weekend visit afterwards." I hung up and immediately called Marcus. "They're pushing for more control. We need to be ready. Document everything," he advised, "and consider filing for a formal custody order that explicitly limits their authority, even during visits." I agreed. The next day, I filed the paperwork for a court order specifying my sole legal custody and detailing the limited decision-making power the grandparents had during visitation. This direct challenge infuriated the Harringtons. Bradford Whitaker called Marcus, his usual polish cracking. "This is unnecessary and provocative," he blustered. "My clients are merely trying to enrich their grandchildren's lives. By attempting to remove them from school without parental permission?" Marcus countered. "That's not enrichment, it's kidnapping." The custody order was granted swiftly, a straightforward decision given that I was an obviously fit parent. The judge seemed puzzled that it was even necessary but acknowledged that clarity would benefit all parties. We spent Thanksgiving in Ohio with my parents, a bittersweet affair as it was our first major holiday without James. The children found comfort in my parents' unconditional love and the simple traditions of my childhood home, so different from the formal rigidity of the Harrington world. When we returned for the next scheduled visit to Connecticut, the atmosphere had changed. Victoria was icily polite, Richard barely present. They made no attempt to hide their displeasure with me, though they maintained the facade of doting grandparents with Emma and Ethan. As I was leaving after dropping the kids off, Richard called me into his study, the inner sanctum of Harrington power, all leather and mahogany, and the smell of expensive cigars. "You've made a mistake," he said without preamble. "We were trying to work with you, Sarah, to give you a place in our family despite your background. But you've chosen confrontation." I met his gaze steadily. "I've chosen to protect my children and respect their father's wishes for their upbringing." He scoffed. James would have wanted his children raised as Harringtons. James left the family business to forge his own path, I reminded him. He wanted something different for himself and for them. Richard's face flushed. He was finding his way back. If he had lived, he would have eventually taken his rightful place in the family legacy. I doubted this revisionist history, but chose not to argue. Regardless, I am now responsible for honoring what I know were his values. "Consider carefully what you're doing," he said, voice low and threatening. "We have resources you cannot imagine. Fighting us will only hurt you and, ultimately, the children." I stood to leave. "I'm not fighting. I'm parenting. There's a difference." As I reached the door, he added, "By the way, the board at James's firm has some concerns about the direction under Michael's leadership. As significant investors, we've requested a review." I turned back. "You don't have controlling interests." His smile was cold. "We have influence in many places you wouldn't expect." It was a warning shot. They were going after James's firm, my financial security. I left without responding, my mind racing. When I picked up the children on Sunday, Emma was quieter than usual. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" I asked on the drive home. She fidgeted with her seatbelt. "Grandma said they might have to go to court to save us." My hands tightened on the wheel. "Save you from what?" "From not being real Harringtons," she said in a small voice. "She said you're keeping us from our birthright, and that Daddy would be sad about it." I pulled over and turned to face both children. "Listen to me. Your father loved you exactly as you are. He was proud to be your dad, and he was proud of the life we built together. Being a Harrington isn't about where you go to school or what clubs you join or how much money you have. It's about being kind and honest and standing up for what's right. All the things your dad valued." Ethan piped up from the back seat. "Grandpa said we could have ponies if we lived with them." Despite everything, I had to smile. Ponies are nice, but they're not more important than our family being together. Emma studied my face. "Are we going to have to go to court?" "I hope not," I said honestly. "But if we do, it's because I'm fighting for what Dad wanted for you. And I promise, no matter what happens, we'll be okay." I hugged them both and continued driving, outwardly calm while my mind strategized. The Harringtons were escalating, attempting to alienate the children from me while simultaneously attacking my financial foundation. Classic pincer movement. Two could play at that game. The next morning, I called Michael and warned him about Richard's threat to the firm. Michael was concerned, but not panicked. "Richard's been trying to get a foothold here for years," he explained. "He has some influence with a couple of board members, but not enough to force changes. Still, we should be prepared." I spent the next week gathering information, calling in favors, and consulting experts. If the Harringtons wanted war, I would be armed with more than just righteous indignation. Through Lisa, I learned that Richard had leveraged several Harrington properties to cover investment losses. Victoria's family trust, which had once been substantial, was now being used to maintain their lavish lifestyle. They were wealthy on paper, but increasingly cash poor. From Michael, I discovered that Richard had approached several key clients of James's firm, attempting to convince them to withdraw their investments. So far, none had done so. The firm's performance was too good to abandon on mere innuendo. Through my own legal connections, I learned the Harringtons had consulted with not one but 3 family law firms in Connecticut, presumably shopping for the most aggressive approach to gaining custody. I also hired a private investigator, ethically questionable perhaps, but necessary. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. The PI's report was illuminating. Richard had serious gambling debts at several exclusive casinos. Victoria had been in rehab for alcohol dependency twice in the past decade. Their marriage was essentially a business arrangement at this point, with both maintaining separate residences most of the time despite the facade of family unity. Armed with this knowledge, I prepared for their next move. It came sooner than expected and from an unexpected direction. Part 4. The false accusation. They even hinted at seeking partial custody, citing their ability to provide exceptional educational and cultural opportunities and expressing concerns about the children's emotional development in a single-parent household. The battle lines were drawn. The court date was set for January 15th, just after the new year. In the meantime, I continued the bi-weekly visits, but insisted they take place at a neutral location, a family center with supervision available if needed. The Harringtons objected strenuously, but complied rather than risk looking uncooperative before the hearing. During this period, I implemented another part of my strategy. I invited Michael from James's firm to dinner at our home. The children adore him. He had been Uncle Mike to them since birth, a constant presence at birthday parties and occasional weekend barbecues. After dinner, when the kids were occupied with a movie, we talked business. Richard's been making moves, Michael confirmed. He approached 2 board members about a strategic restructuring that would essentially fold us into Harrington Enterprises. That can't happen, I said firmly. James built this firm specifically to operate differently. Michael nodded. The board is split. Some see the advantages of the Harrington name and connections. Others are loyal to James's vision. I took a deep breath. I've been thinking about taking a more active role. Not in day-to-day operations, that's your domain, but in strategic direction and maintaining James's ethical framework. Michael's face lit up. That would make a huge difference. Your vote combined with mine, and the loyal board members would block any takeover attempt. I'll need to get up to speed quickly, I warned. And Richard won't take this lying down. Let him come, Michael said with unexpected ferocity. James was my best friend. I won't let his father dismantle what he built. That night, after everyone had left and the children were asleep, I sat in James's home office, surrounded by his books and papers. I ran my fingers over his desk, the wood smooth from years of use. I'm fighting for everything you built, I whispered to the empty room. For the kids, for your legacy, for us. I could almost hear his response. You've got this, Sarah. You always were the strategist in the family. The court date approached with the slow inevitability of an oncoming train. The holidays were a tense affair. I took the children to Ohio for Christmas, where they were showered with love and normal grandparent attention from my parents. We returned for the obligatory weekend visit with the Harringtons, where Victoria made pointed comments about their last Christmas as outsiders, and Richard showed them photos of the pony stables at their summer home. Marcus and I prepared meticulously for court. We gathered statements from the children's teachers, their therapist, our neighbors, and friends who had observed our family dynamic both before and after James's death. We documented every manipulative comment, every attempt to bribe the children, every undermining action. We also prepared for their financial attack. I formally accepted a board position at James's firm and spent hours with Michael and other executives learning the business inside and out. We secured commitments from key clients and investors, reinforcing their confidence in the firm's direction. The day before the court hearing, I received a text from Lisa. Be careful tomorrow. Richard's been making calls. He's confident. It was concerning but not surprising. Richard Harrington was used to the world bending to his will, courts included. Money talked, and few talked louder than the Harrington fortune. But I had something Richard didn't understand, the truth on my side, and a strategic mind he had consistently underestimated. Part 5. The Courtroom. Family court in Connecticut was housed in a stately brick building, less imposing than the criminal courthouse, but designed to convey authority nonetheless. I arrived early with Marcus, dressed in a conservative navy suit that projected both professionalism and maternal warmth. The Harringtons arrived with an entourage, Bradford Whitaker, 2 junior associates, and a woman I didn't recognize but who screamed, expert witness with her professional demeanor and portfolio case. Judge Eleanor Schaefer had a reputation for being thorough and fair, with little patience for gamesmanship. She had reviewed all the filings before the hearing and began by establishing the scope of the proceedings. "We have two competing motions before the court," she noted. Mrs. Sarah Harrington seeks to modify the current informal visitation arrangement with Mr. and Mrs. Richard Harrington, the paternal grandparents, citing concerns about interference with parental authority. The grandparents seek expanded visitation rights and have hinted at a desire for partial custody, citing their ability to provide enhanced opportunities for the minor children. She looked at both legal teams over her reading glasses. "Let me be clear. The bar for restricting grandparent visitation is high, but the bar for overriding a fit parent's custody is even higher. I'll hear all relevant evidence, but keep those standards in mind." Bradford Whitaker rose first, all patrician confidence. "Your Honor, this case fundamentally concerns what's best for Emma and Ethan Harrington. Their father's tragic death left them without his guidance and connection to their heritage. My clients simply wish to ensure the children maintain their birthright, the education, social connections, and cultural experiences befitting the Harrington name." Judge Schaefer's expression remained neutral. "And you believe these factors override maternal custody rights?" Whitaker chose his words carefully. "We believe these factors should be considered alongside Mrs. Harrington's parenting. The children's best interests might be served by a more collaborative approach to major decisions." Marcus stood next. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about the children's best interests. But it's also about a calculated campaign by wealthy, influential grandparents to undermine and eventually replace a fit and loving mother. Mrs. Harrington has not only maintained a stable, nurturing home during an unimaginably difficult time, but has actively facilitated the grandparents' relationship with the children despite their increasingly concerning behavior." The evidence presentation began with the Harrington side. Victoria testified about her close relationship with the children, her concerns about their emotional well-being after James's death, and her desire to provide them with advantages only the Harrington connections can secure. Under cross-examination by Marcus, however, her facade began to crack. "Mrs. Harrington, you testified that you're concerned about the children's emotional well-being. How many of their therapy sessions have you attended?" Victoria blinked. "Well, none. Sarah hasn't invited me." "Did you ask to attend?" "No, but have you consulted with their therapist about appropriate ways to support grieving children?" "We have our own experts who have never met Emma and Ethan," Marcus pointed out. "You also testified about your close relationship with the children. Before their father's death, how often did you see them?" Victoria shifted uncomfortably. "We saw them at major holidays, and they visited in the summer." "So, approximately 5 to 6 times per year?" "Approximately. And now you're seeking overnight visits 3 weekends per month plus all major holidays and summers. That's quite an increase, isn't it?" Victoria's smile was tight. "We feel it's necessary under the circumstances." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "These circumstances being that their mother is now solely responsible for decisions about their future?" Bradford objected, and Judge Schaefer instructed Marcus to move on. Richard's testimony focused on financial security and educational opportunities. He outlined the extensive Harrington resources available to the children and expressed grave concerns about their future if they weren't properly integrated into the family legacy. During cross-examination, Marcus was relentless. "Mr. Harrington, you've spoken at length about the Harrington legacy. Was your son, James, an active part of that legacy?" Richard frowned. He was finding his way back to family responsibilities. "Is that so?" "Because he founded a competing investment firm with a fundamentally different philosophy, didn't he?" "It was a youthful experiment. A successful experiment that has outperformed Harrington Enterprises for the past 5 years, Marcus noted. "In fact, isn't it true that you've recently attempted to gain control of that firm through board manipulation?" Bradford objected vigorously, but the question had achieved its purpose, linking the custody battle to Richard's financial motivations. Their expert witness, Dr. Elaine Werner, testified about the importance of extended family in childhood development, particularly following parental loss. She spoke in broad generalities about wealth providing opportunities and stability. When it was my legal team's turn, we presented a starkly different picture. My testimony focused on the children's daily lives, their emotional progress since losing their father, and the consistent, loving environment I maintained. I detailed the escalating interference from the Harringtons, the unauthorized travel plans, the undermining comments, the attempts to bribe the children with ponies and privileges. After James died, I wanted his parents to have a relationship with Emma and Ethan. I explained. They are part of the children's heritage. But that relationship needs to be healthy and supportive, not manipulative and controlling. When Bradford cross-examined me, he focused on my resources compared to the Harringtons. Mrs. Harrington, you cannot provide the same educational opportunities as my clients, can you? I can provide excellent educational opportunities, I responded calmly. James and I chose our community specifically for its strong public schools. We believed in education that exposes children to diverse peers and perspectives. But not the elite connections that come with institutions like Grayson Academy. James attended Grayson. He specifically did not want that for his own children. He valued substance over status. Bradford tried another angle. Since your husband's death, you've been working full-time while parenting 2 grieving children. That must be overwhelming. It's challenging, I acknowledged. But I have strong support systems, flexible work arrangements, and excellent childcare. More importantly, I'm the constant in their lives when everything else changed. Wouldn't additional support from their grandparents alleviate some of that burden? I met his gaze directly.
Support, yes.
Attempted replacement, no. There's a difference between helping and taking over. Our strongest evidence came from unexpected sources. The children's therapist testified about their healthy adjustment despite their loss, noting that stability and routine with their primary attachment figure, me, was crucial to their continued healing. Emma's teacher described a well-adjusted child who occasionally had difficult days but was thriving academically and socially. Ethan's preschool director confirmed the same. But our most compelling witness was Diana Reyes from Child Protective Services. Although she couldn't reveal who made the anonymous report, she testified about finding 0 evidence of neglect or substance abuse in her thorough investigation. She described a loving, organized household and children who clearly felt safe and secure with their mother. In your professional opinion, Marcus asked, would it serve these children's best interests to reduce their time with their mother in favor of increased time with their grandparents? Based on my observations, no, Diana replied firmly. These children need consistency and security after their loss. Mrs. Harrington provides that admirably. The final bombshell came when Marcus called Lisa to the stand. As James's cousin and a Harrington family member, her testimony carried particular weight. Lisa, can you describe the conversations you've had with the defendants regarding Sarah and the children following James's death? Lisa glanced at Richard and Victoria, who both looked thunderous. Uncle Richard called me in May, about a month after James died. He said the family needed to secure the Harrington heirs before, and I quote, that gold digger turns them against us or gets her hands on the family money. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Victoria's face had gone white. Did he elaborate on how he planned to secure the heirs? Lisa nodded. He said they would start with increased visitation, then push for shared custody. He mentioned using their financial resources to make Sarah look incompetent or unstable if necessary. Bradford was on his feet immediately, objecting to hearsay and questioning Lisa's credibility as an estranged family member. Judge Schaefer allowed the testimony, but noted she would consider the family dynamics when weighing its reliability. In closing arguments, Bradford emphasized the Harringtons' resources, status, and desire to maintain their family connection with their grandchildren. He painted them as loving grandparents being unnecessarily restricted by an insecure mother. Marcus focused on the evidence of manipulation and control, the stable environment I provided, and the fundamental legal standard. Fit parents have the right to make decisions for their children absent extraordinary circumstances. The only extraordinary circumstance here, he concluded, is the lengths to which wealthy, Privileged grandparents will go to control a family legacy, with little regard for the actual best interests of two children who have already suffered an unimaginable loss. Judge Schaefer took the matter under advisement, promising a ruling within the week. As we left the courthouse, reporters were waiting. The Harrington name attracted attention, and a family feud was always newsworthy. Richard paused on the steps, Victoria beside him, the picture of dignified concern. "We only want what's best for our grandchildren," he told the cameras. "The opportunities and security that are their birthright." I could have walked by, maintained the higher ground, but something in me snapped at his performance. I approached the microphones. "What's best for Emma and Ethan is to be raised according to their father's values, with integrity, empathy, and respect for others regardless of wealth or status. That's the true Harrington legacy I'm protecting." The soundbite made the evening news. Back home, I tucked the children into bed, trying to shield them from the tension while being honest about the proceedings in age-appropriate ways. "Did we win?" Emma asked sleepily. "The judge is thinking about what's best for everyone," I explained. "But no matter what she decides, nothing changes the most important thing: how much I love you, and how much Daddy loved you." "And Grandma and Grandpa?" Ethan asked. I chose my words carefully. "They love you in their way. Sometimes grown-ups disagree about how to show love. But you don't need to worry about that." The waiting was excruciating. I threw myself into work, both at my law practice and at James's firm, where a crucial board meeting was approaching. Michael and I prepared meticulously, knowing Richard would make his move soon. The court's decision arrived via email 3 days later. Marcus called immediately. "We won," he said without preamble. Judge Schaefer denied their petition for expanded visitation and granted our motion to modify the arrangement. I sank into a chair, tears of relief springing to my eyes. "What are the terms?" "Visitation remains at every other weekend, but with specific conditions. No overnight stays without your approval, no travel without your written consent, no discussions about custody or living arrangements with the children, and mandatory counseling if they wish to continue even this level of contact." I could barely believe it. She ordered counseling? Family counseling for all parties involved, actually. She was quite clear that the current dynamic is potentially harmful to the children and must change if the relationship is to continue. Judge Schaefer's written opinion was scathing. She cited the troubling pattern of undermining and manipulation by the Harringtons and their apparent inability to recognize appropriate boundaries. She acknowledged their right to a relationship with their grandchildren, but emphasized that this right was secondary to my parental authority and the children's emotional well-being. The victory was sweet but incomplete. I knew the Harringtons well enough by now to recognize they wouldn't simply accept defeat. They would regroup and attack from another angle. I didn't have to wait long to find out what that angle would be. Part 6. The Board Meeting. The showdown at James's firm came exactly 1 week after the court ruling. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. at the company's downtown offices. I arrived early with Michael, reviewing our strategy one final time. Richard arrived with 2 Harrington Enterprises executives and Bradford Whitaker. His confidence seemed undiminished by the court defeat. If anything, he appeared more determined. The boardroom was elegant but understated, reflecting James's preference for substance over flash. 12 board members took their seats around the polished mahogany table. As the majority shareholder following James's death, I sat at the head position he once occupied. Richard's eyes narrowed at this symbolic choice, but he said nothing as the meeting was called to order. The first hour proceeded with routine business, quarterly reports, client acquisition updates, investment performance metrics. James's firm continued to outperform market benchmarks and was attracting significant new capital. Then Richard made his move during the new business portion of the agenda. "I'd like to propose a strategic restructuring," he announced smoothly. "Harrington Enterprises is prepared to acquire a controlling interest in the firm and integrate its operations into our broader financial services division." He presented documents outlining the proposal, a buyout offer that, while financially generous, would effectively dismantle everything James had built. The ethical investment standards would become guidelines. The independent management would be replaced with Harrington loyalists. Even the name would change to Harrington Wealth Advisors. This offers shareholders exceptional value, Richard concluded, and provides stability following the unfortunate loss of the firm's founder. Several board members looked thoughtful. The offer price was indeed substantial, a 30% premium over current valuation. For those who viewed their position solely as a financial investment, it was tempting. Michael spoke first in opposition. This proposal fundamentally contradicts the firm's founding principles and differentiated market position. Our ethical investment standards aren't window dressing. They're our core competitive advantage. Richard smiled condescendingly. Principles are admirable, but business is business. The Harrington name and resources would accelerate growth beyond anything you could achieve independently. I had remained silent, observing the room dynamics. 3 board members were clearly leaning toward Richard's proposal, for we're firmly aligned with Michael's position. The remaining 4 seemed genuinely undecided, weighing the financial benefits against the company's mission. Now I stood, commanding the room's attention. Before we consider this proposal further, I'd like to share some information relevant to the decision, I said calmly. I distributed folders to each board member. These documents detail Richard Harrington's recent investment performance at Harrington Enterprises, his current debt leveraging, and the ethical violations that have been quietly settled over the past 5 years. Richard's face flushed dark red. Where did you get this information? This is private. Much of it is public record, if you know where to look, I replied. The rest came from concerned individuals within your organization. The documents painted a damning picture. Richard had made a series of increasingly risky investments trying to recoup earlier losses. He had leveraged Harrington family properties, including the Connecticut estate, against these bets. Most concerning, Harrington Enterprises had settled 3 SEC investigations with substantial fines but no admission of wrongdoing. This acquisition isn't about growth or synergy, I continued, meeting the gaze of each board member. It's about absorbing a successful competitor and accessing liquid capital to cover mounting losses elsewhere. Our firm would be stripped for parts within a year. Richard was on his feet now, shouting about slander and confidentiality breaches. Bradford was trying to calm him while simultaneously threatening legal action. I remained composed. James founded this firm because he believed ethical investment wasn't just morally right but financially sound. Our 5-year returns prove he was correct. We don't need the Harrington name or resources, they need ours. I turned directly to Richard. You've been trying to control what James built because you couldn't control him. First through my children, now through this hostile takeover. It stops today. The room was silent. Even Richard seemed momentarily at a loss for words. I move we vote on the acquisition proposal, I said quietly. The vote wasn't even close. 9-3 against the acquisition, with Richard's allies the only supporters. Additionally, I continued, I propose amending the company charter to require a 75% shareholder vote for any future acquisition or substantial restructuring, ensuring the firm's ethical framework and independence remain protected. This passed 8-4, establishing a firewall against future attempts. As the meeting concluded, Richard approached me, his mask of civility completely gone. You think you've won, he hissed low enough that only I could hear. But you're playing in a world you don't understand. This isn't over. I met his gaze steadily. You're right about one thing. I didn't understand your world initially. Its privilege, its entitlement, its willingness to destroy anything and anyone that doesn't conform. But I'm a quick study. I stepped closer, my voice equally low. James taught me that true strength isn't about wealth or power. It's about integrity. That's why he left, why he built something different, why he chose me. And that's why you'll never win, because you're fighting for control, while I'm fighting for his legacy. Richard stormed out, Bradford hurrying after him. Several board members approached to congratulate me on successfully protecting the firm's independence. Michael looked both impressed and slightly stunned. That was masterly, he said when we were alone. James would have been proud. The thought brought both pain and comfort. He taught me more than he knew, I replied. And I'm just getting started. Part 7. The Final Play. Richard's threat proved to be more than empty words. Within weeks, a new attack began, this time targeting the firm's clients and my professional reputation simultaneously. Rumors began circulating in financial circles that the firm was in trouble despite its strong performance. Several major clients received anonymous information packets suggesting investment irregularities. At the same time, whispers spread in legal circles questioning my competence and stability following James's death. It was a coordinated campaign of whispers and innuendo, difficult to combat directly because the sources remained shadowy. The Harrington influence was vast and insidious. The impact was real. 2 significant clients withdrew their investments despite Michael's reassurances. A potential client for my legal practice canceled our consultation without explanation. Even some parents at the children's school began treating me with subtle distance. It's classic character assassination, Marcus observed grimly when I called him for advice. They're trying to isolate you professionally and socially. I need to fight back, I said, pacing my home office. But how do you fight shadows? With light, he replied simply. Everything they're doing relies on secrecy and deniability. Remove those and their tactics fall apart. He was right. If the Harringtons wanted to play dirty, they'd soon learn I was willing to get my hands dirty too, but unlike them, I'd do it in broad daylight. My counteroffensive began with a simple email to Richard and Victoria, copying Bradford Whitaker. It read, I am aware of the coordinated campaign to damage my professional reputation and James's firm. As you've chosen to escalate matters beyond the family court ruling, I feel compelled to inform you of my response plan. 1. I will be giving an exclusive interview to the Financial Times detailing the attempted hostile takeover of the firm, including documentation of Harrington Enterprises' financial difficulties that motivated it. 2. I will file a formal complaint with the Connecticut Bar Association regarding Mr. Whitaker's role in coordinating defamatory communications about a fellow attorney. 3. I will provide all evidence of harassment and defamation to the family court as grounds for potentially restricting your access to Emma and Ethan further. These actions can be avoided with the following: an immediate cessation of all defamatory activities, a public statement of support for the firm's continued independence, your attendance at the family counseling sessions ordered by the court, a written agreement to respect the boundaries established by the court ruling. I await your response within 48 hours. Bradford called within the hour, his voice strained. Mrs. Harrington, this email could be construed as blackmail. Not at all, I replied calmly. I'm simply informing your clients of the legitimate legal and public relations responses I'm prepared to take if the harassment continues. Everything I've outlined is within my rights. The Harringtons deny any campaign against you or the firm. I have evidence suggesting otherwise. I bluffed. I had suspicious timing and circumstantial connections, but not quite the smoking gun I implied. I'd be happy to present it in court or to journalists. Financial Times is particularly interested in how old money families maintain control in modern finance. There was a long pause. What exactly are you hoping to achieve? Peace, I said simply. I want to raise my children without constant battles. I want to honor James's professional legacy. I want his parents to have a healthy relationship with their grandchildren without undermining me or attempting to control us. I'll convey your perspective to my clients. Richard's response came the next day, not via Bradford, but in person. He appeared at my office unannounced, somehow charming my assistant into letting him through. He looked older than he had at the board meeting, the strain of recent defeats evident in the new lines around his eyes. But his bearing remained proud as he took the seat across from my desk without waiting for an invitation. Impressive maneuver, he said without preamble. James always said you were the strategic one. I kept my expression neutral. Thank you for coming, Richard. I assume you're here to discuss my email. He nodded. Direct confrontation. I can respect that approach, even if I don't appreciate being on the receiving end. Then you acknowledge the campaign against me? He waved a dismissive hand. Let's not play games. We both know how influence works. Nothing explicit. Nothing traceable. Just conversations in the right ears. It was the closest to an admission I would get. And now those conversations will stop. Richard studied me with new intensity. You know, I misjudged you from the beginning. I saw the middle-class girl from Ohio as an accessory to James's rebellion, a phase he would outgrow. James didn't see class or status the way you do, I replied. He valued people for who they are, not what they represent or possess. A luxury afforded by being born into privilege, Richard countered. He could reject the Harrington way because he always had it as a safety net. I leaned forward. Is that why you've been so determined to control his children? To ensure they don't reject your values too? Richard was silent for a moment. The Harrington legacy spans generations. Everything I've built, everything my father and his father built, was meant to be passed down. When James walked away, it felt like watching a dynasty crumble. For the first time, I glimpsed the fear beneath Richard's ruthless exterior, the terror of irrelevance, of a life's work rendered meaningless. The children are James's legacy too, I said more gently. But he wanted them to build their own lives, not live according to a predetermined script. And you? What do you want for them? To be kind, to be resilient, to know they were deeply loved by their father, to understand both sides of their heritage, but choose their own paths. Richard nodded slowly. Victoria won't be pleased, but I'm prepared to agree to your terms. The campaign ends today. We'll issue a statement supporting the firm's independence. We'll attend the damn counseling sessions. I wasn't naive enough to trust his sudden capitulation entirely. And the boundaries established by the court? We'll respect them, he said with visible effort. But I hope, with time, you might consider more flexibility in our relationship with Emma and Ethan. Not because of our status or resources, but because they're the only connection to James we have left. The vulnerability in that statement took me by surprise. If you approach that relationship with respect rather than entitlement, there's room for it to grow naturally. We hammered out the details of our truce. The statement supporting the firm would be released that afternoon. The rumors would be countered with subtle endorsements from Harrington allies. The first counseling session was scheduled for the following week. As Richard prepared to leave, he paused at the door. James would be proud of how fiercely you've protected his children and his legacy. He chose well. Coming from Richard Harrington, it was as close to a blessing as I would ever receive. The peace held, albeit tenuously at first. The counseling sessions were awkward initially, with Victoria barely participating and Richard struggling to express emotions rather than issue directives. But over time, small changes emerged. Victoria began asking about the children's interests rather than imposing her preferences. Richard occasionally shared stories about James's childhood, without the usual subtext about family obligations. They learned to request time with the children rather than demand it. At the firm, the client exodus stopped, and new investments began flowing in as our strong performance continued to attract attention. Michael and I established a clear leadership dynamic that honored James's vision while allowing for growth and innovation. Most importantly, Emma and Ethan began to heal. With the tension between their mother and grandparents reduced, they could enjoy their relationship with both sides of their family without feeling caught in the middle. Emma's nightmares decreased. Ethan's clinginess eased. They spoke more freely about their father, preserving his memory without the weight of grief crushing their childhood. 1 year after James's death, I took the children to place flowers at his grave. The spring sun warmed the polished granite as Emma carefully arranged tulips, his favorite, in the built-in vase. "Daddy would like these," she said confidently. "They're happy flowers." "They sure are," I agreed, blinking back tears. Just like he was a happy dad. Ethan, now 5, patted the headstone as if comforting it. "Don't worry, Daddy. We're doing okay. Mommy is super strong. And Grandpa taught me chess, but I let him win sometimes 'cause he gets grumpy." I stifled a laugh. Richard had indeed been teaching Ethan chess during their visits, displaying more patience than I'd ever seen from him. And yes, he still got grumpy when he lost. As we walked back to the car, Emma took my hand. "Mom, are we going to be all right forever now?" I squeezed her small fingers. "Life doesn't work that way, sweetheart. We'll have good days and hard days. but we're stronger now than we were. We know we can handle tough things together." She considered this with a serious expression that reminded me so much of James. "Like how you handled Grandma and Grandpa when they were being mean?" "Children miss nothing. They weren't being mean exactly," I explained carefully. "They were sad and scared about losing your dad, and they didn't know how to handle those feelings properly. Sometimes adults make mistakes too." "But you fixed it," Ethan chimed in with absolute faith. I smiled at his simplistic view. Not alone. Everyone had to decide to make things better. That's how most problems get solved, people choosing to work together instead of against each other. That evening, I sat on our back deck watching the children play in the yard. My phone buzzed with an email. The firm had just landed a major new client who specifically cited our ethical investment framework as the deciding factor. I looked up at the fading sky, thinking of James. "We did it," I whispered. "We protected everything that mattered to you." The journey from devastated widow to confident victor hadn't been easy or straight. I had been forced to find strength I didn't know I possessed, to develop strategies I never thought I'd need, to become a formidable opponent to people who had vastly underestimated me. The Harringtons had seen only what they expected to see, a middle-class girl out of her depth in their world of privilege and power. They never realized that by trying to take everything from me, they had freed me from the constraints of fear and deference that might otherwise have limited me. In trying to control James's legacy, they had instead unleashed its full potential through me. I wasn't naive enough to believe the peace would last forever. Richard and Victoria were who they were, and old habits die hard. But the balance of power had shifted permanently. They now understood that crossing me carried consequences they weren't willing to bear. More importantly, I had discovered my own capacity for strategic thinking, for righteous battle, for protecting what I loved with unwavering determination. I had built alliances, leveraged resources, and outmaneuvered opponents who had vastly more experience and traditional power. James had always told me I was the strongest person he knew. I hadn't believed him then. I do now. As the sun set behind our modest but comfortable home, casting long shadows across the yard where our children played, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that rainy night in April when everything changed. Peace. Not just the absence of conflict, but the deep-rooted confidence that whatever came next, we would face it and prevail. Richard had been right about one thing. James had chosen well. Just not in the way Richard meant. James had chosen a partner who would fight for his children and his values with everything she had, who would stand against the tide of wealth and privilege when it threatened to sweep away what truly mattered, who would rebuild from ashes a life that honored his memory while forging a new path forward. Emma ran up to show me a dandelion she'd found, her father's eyes shining in her small face. Ethan followed, James's crooked smile lighting up his features as he attempted a cartwheel on the lawn. These were the true Harrington heirs, not vessels for an outdated legacy, but bright, unique spirits carrying forward the best of their father in their own way. And I would make damn sure they had the freedom to become whoever they were meant to be.
The end.